So on August 15th, 1914, the United States basically threw the most expensive, the most ambitious party in the history of the planet.
Right.
And the rest of the world completely ignored it.
They really did.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a stack of historical records, engineering specs, and most importantly, first-hand testimonies from 1963.
Yeah, these documents are incredible.
They are, and our mission today is to pull back the curtain on one of the greatest engineering marvels in history, which is the Panama Canal.
Right. But we aren't just here to talk about concrete and water.
Exactly. Our goal is to uncover the hidden human cost behind the canal and to really understand the people who actually built it.
Because there's this massive blind spot in the history.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this. We have the central glaring contrast. On one hand, you have this grand opening, and on the other, you have the hidden, often brutal reality of the builders.
Right.
So let's start with that opening day. The scene is supposed to be triumphant. We have this cargo and passenger steamer. It's called the SS Ancon, making the first official transit.
Yeah, the Ancon is carrying about 200 dignitaries, making the crossing from the Atlantic side at Cristobal right over to the Pacific.
Which is just a massive deal.
Oh, it was huge. This was the culmination of decades of blood, sweat, and just unimaginable wealth poured into the earth.
Yeah.
It's meant to be this massive global spectacle, complete with a grand international naval celebration.
I read there were supposed to be armadas from every major world power steaming through the locks in a grand parade of human progress.
That was the plan, yeah.
But almost no one noticed. I mean, the headlines weren't about the canal at all. And looking at the timeline, it's obvious why.
Yeah, the dates line up perfectly for a disaster.
Right. It's the first week of August 1914. Europe had literally just plunged into the First World War.
Exactly. The timing is one of the most striking and, frankly, bitter historical ironies. You have the absolute peak of industrial ambition opening in near total silence because of the guns of August.
Because Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in late June.
Right. And by the first week of August, the treaties had triggered. Empires were colliding.
Germany was invading Belgium.
Yeah, so the headlines across the globe weren't about human progress or uniting the oceans for the betterment of global trade.
Of course not. They were about the mobilization of millions of soldiers and the start of a devastating global conflict.
The attention of the world was entirely consumed by the outbreak of war.
So the United States government looks at this geopolitical landscape, all these European powers suddenly at each other's throats, and they realize they can't throw a massive international party right now.
No, it's not just in poor taste, right? It's a massive security risk.
That makes sense.
That's precisely what happened. The geopolitical tension of August 1914 forced the U.S. to pivot instantly.
Wow.
They quietly canceled the grand celebration. And in doing so, the administrative narrative of the canal shifted literally overnight.
What do you mean by shifted?
Well, it went from being heralded as this utopian triumph of human progress to being immediately classified as a guarded strategic military asset.
Oh, right. Because the U.S. Navy needed it.
Exactly. They needed it to move fleets between the Atlantic and the Pacific without going all the way around South America.
That was suddenly its primary purpose.
Right. So the most ambitious construction project on Earth opened almost in silence. The dignitaries on the Ancon celebrated, but globally, it was a whisper.
The world missed the opening because they were looking at a war in Europe. But as I dig into these sources, it becomes clear that the world had also been conditioned to look completely past the very people who built the canal.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just that the opening was ignored because of bad timing, it's that the builders were fundamentally designed to be ignored by the system itself.
The silence of August 1914 is almost poetic when you consider the forced silence of the workforce leading up to that exact moment.
Yeah, that's perfectly said, because the elegance of the machine relies entirely on the brutality of the labor.
It does.
And to understand that brutality, we really need to understand how the machine actually works. Because the Panama Canal is, I think, widely misunderstood.
I agree. When you hear the word canal, you probably picture a ditch.
Right, it's just a trench connecting two bodies of water.
Which is exactly what the French tried and failed catastrophically to do in the late 19th century.
Under Ferdinand de Lesseps, right.
Yes, under Lesseps. They envisioned a sea level cut, just like they had done with the Suez Canal.
But the Suez is essentially a trench dug through flat sand.
Exactly. Panama is a geographical nightmare for a sea level cut. You have the Continental Divide, you've got rugged mountains and torrential tropical rains that cause massive flooding.
So a sea level cut was just a fatal dream.
Completely fatal. It was never going to work.
So the American era of construction, which began in 1904, they went with a brilliantly different approach.
They really did.
They didn't try to cut all the way down through the mountains to sea level. They decided to lift the ships over the mountains using water.
The mechanics of the transit are an absolute marvel of elegant engineering. I mean, to understand it, let's follow the Ancon again as it enters from the Caribbean side.
Okay, let's picture it.
The ship arrives at the Gatun locks. Now, these aren't just little river gates. We're talking about 3 massive concrete chambers.
Wait, how big are we talking?
Each individual chamber is 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, and about 80 feet deep.
That is essentially the size of 3 city blocks stacked end to end, holding an entire ship.
Right. And to lift the Ancon, a total of 85 feet above sea level, it has to reach the artificial Gatun Lake.
And they had to make that lake, right?
Yes.
Huh?
To make this lake, they dammed the volatile Chagres River, basically flooding a massive portion of the Panamanian interior.
Wow.
It was the largest artificial lake in the world at the time. But here's the truly brilliant part about getting the ship up to that lake. They didn't use massive industrial water pumps.
Wait, I was looking at the schematics and the sources, and this blew my mind. There are no pumps.
None.
How do you move millions of gallons of water to lift a steamship without pumps?
Gravity.
It's gravity.
Just gravity. The entire system is gravity-fed. Gatun Lake sits 85 feet above sea level, so the water naturally wants to flow down to the ocean.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the engineers built massive culverts, essentially tunnels the size of train tubes, built deep into the concrete walls of the locks.
So they just let the water fall.
Exactly. By simply opening and closing a series of massive valves, they allow the water from Gatun Lake to flow down through these culverts and empty into the lock chambers from beneath.
Right under the ship.
Right under the ship. The water fills the chamber, gently raising the vessel. It is an incredibly peaceful, quiet mechanism.
So the ship floats up to the next level, the massive steel gates swing open, it moves forward, and the process repeats.
That's it?
The analogy that always comes to mind for me is a giant, elegant water staircase.
It really is.
It's so smooth. The ship glides up the steps, crosses the great expanse of Gatun Lake, and then it has to navigate the Culebra Cut.
Also known as the Gaillard Cut later on, yeah.
Right, which is this massive 9-mile gash carved right through the Continental Divide.
Yeah.
And after passing through that cut, it descends via the Pedro Miguel lock, which is 1 chamber, and then the Miraflores locks, which have 2 chambers, lowering it back down to the Pacific Ocean.
That's the entire transit. 9 to 10 hours of graceful, mechanized precision. You just open a valve, gravity does the work, and the mountains are conquered.
Okay, but I have to push back here.
Please do.
We talk about the sanitized narrative, gravity and water doing the heavy lifting, the elegance of the pumpless system.
Right.
But for gravity to work, water needs a path through the mountains.
Yeah.
And carving that path through the Continental Divide, that was the opposite of elegant.
Oh, completely.
We're marveling at the water, but who actually dug the hole for the water to fill? Who blasted the rock for those 1,000-foot chambers?
And that brings us to the real crux of the issue. The elegance of those pumpless, gravity-fed locks is a stark, jarring contrast to the raw, bloody manual labor required to actually carve that path.
Yeah.
The engineering was elegant, the labor was brute force.
And the system designed to manage that brute force is what we really need to look at today.
Absolutely.
Because the contrast between the pristine water staircase and the reality of the dirt and blood brings us to how the United States categorized human beings in the Canal Zone.
They instituted a dual payroll system.
Right, the gold roll and the silver roll.
Yes. From 1904, when the U.S. took over the project, the Canal Zone was run entirely on this dual system.
Let's explain where this even came from, because I'm looking at the historical record here, and it doesn't start out explicitly as a racial policy, did it?
No, it didn't.
Was it just a lazy bureaucratic carryover, or was it malicious from day one?
It's a great question, and the distinction is really important. Initially, it was just a bureaucratic carryover. The United States inherited the concept from the old Panama Railroad days, back in the mid-19th century.
When they were building the railway across the isthmus.
Exactly. Back then, the railroad company paid its American management and its specialized white workers in U.S. gold coin.
Because the gold standard was stable.
Right. And they paid the local unskilled laborers in local silver coin, which fluctuated in value.
Okay.
So structurally, it was quite literally just a currency distinction based on the type of money different classes of workers received.
So they inherited this currency difference from the railroad, but here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. They didn't just keep it as a payroll quirk.
No, they didn't.
They weaponized it. What starts as a simple logistical difference in currency gold coins versus silver coins is taken by the United States government and morphed into a rigid, highly codified racial caste system.
Staggering.
They essentially imported Jim Crow laws wholesale and dropped them directly onto foreign soil in the jungle.
To understand the scale of this weaponization, you have to look at the demographics of the workforce.
Right.
When we talk about the people who built the canal, we are overwhelmingly talking about the silver roll.
The people doing the actual digging.
Yes. This consisted of roughly 150,000 Black West Indian workers.
Wow, 150,000.
Yeah, they migrated primarily from Jamaica and Barbados, drawn by the promise of steady work.
Which makes sense.
These men were the true builders of the canal. They wielded the shovels, they placed the dynamite, they drove the trains, and they moved the earth.
While the gold roll, on the other hand, consisted almost entirely of white Americans and a few Northern Europeans.
Right.
They were the engineers, the managers, the foremen, the doctors.
What's fascinating here is, well, it's horrifying really, is what the records show about how quickly the U.S. administrative state realized they could use that logistical quirk of gold and silver to engineer their workforce.
Because in the early 1900s, American administrators were heavily influenced by these emerging ideas of scientific management, right?
Yeah, so-called Taylorism, and also social Darwinism.
Right.
They viewed human labor as just another raw material to be categorized and optimized. They genuinely believed that segregating the workforce and paying Black workers significantly less would prevent, quote-unquote, labor unrest.
Wow.
And it maintained a hierarchy that kept the massive West Indian workforce compliant and desperate enough to do the lethal work.
It's sickening because it wasn't just a quiet, unspoken prejudice where managers favored people who looked like them. It was written down in the ledgers.
Oh, absolutely. It was state policy.
The transition from a payroll distinction to a hard racial barrier was deliberate. We have the specific orders in the historical record.
We do. In November 1906, the chief engineer, John Stevens, issued an administrative order.
And what did that order do?
It moved most Black workers off the gold roll entirely, regardless of their skill level or previous status.
Wait, really? So even if a West Indian worker was highly skilled, maybe doing clerical work, or he was a specialized mechanic or a heavy machinery operator, Stevens said, no, your skill doesn't matter. You belong on the silver roll.
Precisely. The logic was no longer about the job you did. It was about the color of your skin.
That's just brutal.
And then it was taken a step further at the absolute highest level of the United States government.
By Roosevelt, right?
Yes. In February 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt explicitly ordered that no further non-Americans could be placed on the gold roll entirely.
He cemented the line.
He cemented it. It was an impermeable barrier.
I was looking at the housing specs in these records, and the contrast is just sickening.
It was night and day.
If you were on the gold roll, a white American, your life in the Canal Zone looked like an idealized, highly subsidized version of the American dream, perfectly transplanted to the tropics.
Yeah, it was practically a resort for them.
You were paid high wages in U.S. gold dollars, which gave you immense purchasing power. You lived in comfortable, fully furnished houses. And crucially, those houses had screened windows.
The screens are a massive detail that we really have to expand on.
Yeah, let's talk about the screens.
At the start of the canal project, the medical community was just coming around to the understanding of how yellow fever and malaria were transmitted.
Because for decades, the prevailing theory was miasma, right?
Exactly, miasma. Just bad air from the swamps.
But Dr. William Gorgas understood differently.
Right. Gorgas was the chief sanitary officer for this canal project, and he understood that the vector was actually the mosquito, specifically the Aedes aegypti.
So keeping mosquitoes out wasn't just about comfort for these workers.
Not at all. It was literally a matter of life and death.
But copper screening was expensive.
Very expensive.
So the administrative logic of the Canal Zone dictated that the life-saving infrastructure went exclusively to the gold roll.
Yep. The white American houses were completely wrapped in screens. They had manicured lawns, which kept mosquito breeding grounds away from the homes.
Right, because mosquitoes breed in tall grass and standing water.
Exactly. They had access to top-tier, well-funded hospitals with priority care. They received generous paid leave, usually 6 weeks a year.
6 weeks.
Yeah, to travel back to the States. There were exclusive clubhouses, secure pensions, and entirely separate high-quality schools for their children.
It was a bubble of immense privilege. Now contrast that with the people actually moving the mountains, the 150,000 West Indian workers on the Silver Roll.
The disparity is breathtaking. Silver roll workers were paid poverty wages in local silver coin.
And because the silver coin fluctuated in value, their actual purchasing power was constantly unstable.
Right. And their housing was the exact opposite of that suburban
It's
dream.
me about the housing.
They lived in crowded, tenement-style buildings or open-air barracks.
No screens.
No screens. Imagine living in the sweltering tropical heat, working a brutal 12-hour physical shift, and returning to a packed room with dozens of other men.
And the windows are just open to the jungle.
Exactly. The very insects carrying the diseases that were decimating the workforce could enter freely.
And if they got sick?
The healthcare was completely segregated and chronically underfunded for them.
Of course.
The commissaries where they bought their food were restricted, offering lower quality goods. They had no pensions, no safety net whatsoever.
So if you were injured in a dynamite blast, or you were just too old to work?
You were simply discarded, sent away.
And perhaps most insidiously for the long term, the U.S. government established separate silver schools.
Yes, that's crucial.
The racial divide wasn't just for the adult laborers, you know. The government actively ensured it was passed down to the next generation of children living in the zone.
It's a completely engineered society.
Yeah.
They engineered the social landscape the exact same way they engineered the locks.
With rigid, impermeable gates designed to keep two streams entirely separate.
Exactly. You had the gold stream and the silver stream, and they were never allowed to mix.
And those policies moved directly from the paper ledgers into the physical geography of Panama. The gold and silver system was literally stamped onto the landscape.
It was everywhere.
You couldn't walk down a street without the government reminding you of your perceived worth.
We're looking at photographs in these sources, and the sheer volume of gold and silver signage is overwhelming.
Yeah, it's everywhere in the pictures.
They marked the post office windows. If you were a West Indian worker wanting to mail a portion of your wages home to Barbados, you stood in the silver line.
There were gold commissaries and silver commissaries.
The clubhouses, the train ticket windows, the bathrooms.
Even the public drinking fountains were labeled and placed side by side.
The drinking fountains are perhaps the most visceral, absurd symbol of this imported Jim Crow reality. Two fountains, dispensing the exact same water, but strictly divided by a bureaucratic designation that was entirely a proxy for race.
To really understand how ordinary this cruelty was, let's do a quick illustrative dramatization here to help you picture it.
Okay.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Barbadian digger on a random Tuesday in 1910. The humidity is thick enough to choke on. This worker has just emerged from the Culebra Cut.
Where he's been working since before dawn.
Right. He's been standing in thigh-deep mud, breathing in pulverized rock and dynamite dust, hauling shale since 5 o'clock in the morning. He is physically exhausted, severely dehydrated, and covered in grime.
Right.
He walks up to a building, sees a drinking fountain, and leans in to get a drink of water. But before he can take a sip, a Canal Zone policeman, an American in a crisp, clean uniform, steps right in his path.
The policeman puts a hand on his nightstick and says, "That's a gold fountain. Can't you read the sign?"
The worker, who is just desperate for hydration, gestures to the plumbing underneath the fountains. He says, "It's the exact same water, officer. The pipes are connected right there. I've been in the cut since 5 this morning."
But the policeman doesn't care about the physics of the plumbing, and he certainly doesn't care about the man's labor. He points his baton toward the back of the building. Sign says gold. Silver's around the back. Move along or you'll spend the night explaining it to the magistrate.
The point of looking at a daily interaction like that isn't just to highlight the cruelty, although it is incredibly cruel. It's to highlight the absolute absurdity and the sheer ordinariness of the line.
It was so ordinary.
This wasn't an extraordinary once-a-year event, right? This was everyday life.
Yeah.
A man who is actively risking his life to build an American triumph was threatened with jail time, and denied a basic drink of water based purely on the color of a painted sign.
Because the system dictated every physical movement a person could make in the zone.
It dictated how they drank water, where they bought their food, where their children learned to read.
But crucially, it also dictated how they died.
Yeah. The correlation between the payroll roll and the mortality rate is undeniable.
It's a direct link.
The elegance of the Gatun locks relied on gravity, but gravity required the calibre cut. And the calibre cut was the true meat grinder of the canal project.
The most dangerous, lethal jobs fell entirely to the silver workers.
The calibre cut, which was later renamed the Gaillard cut, was a 9-mile trench that had to be carved through the solid rock and unstable geology of the Continental Divide.
And the geology here is absolutely critical to understanding why it was so deadly.
Right, because we hear Continental Divide and we just think of digging a really deep hole in regular dirt.
Right.
But the geology of Panama made it a nightmare. Let's explain why.
Well, Panama isn't just dirt. The calibre cut specifically was driven through what's known as the Cucaracha Formation.
The Cucaracha Formation.
Yes. It is a highly volatile mix of heavy volcanic basalt rock sitting directly on top of soft, slippery sedimentary clay.
Oh, that sounds like a terrible combination.
It is. So when you start cutting a deep, steep trench through that...
You remove the earth in the middle to make the trench, right?
Right.
And then what happens?
The incredibly heavy volcanic rock on the sides of the mountains suddenly has no support. It pushes down on that soft, slippery clay underneath.
Wow.
The pressure literally squeezes the clay out into the open trench. It's exactly like stepping on a tube of toothpaste.
That's a terrifying image.
The heavy rock presses down, the clay squirts out, and the entire side of the mountain shears off and collapses into the hole you just dug.
And when that mountain shears off, it takes everything with it.
Everything.
These weren't slow landslides. Millions of cubic yards of earth would suddenly collapse without warning, burying rail cars, massive steam shovels, and hundreds of men in a matter of seconds.
It was a Sisyphean task.
Yeah.
You dig a hole for a month, and in 10 seconds, the mountain fills it back in, taking your crew with it.
And to move that much earth, they were using staggering amounts of dynamite.
Oh, massive amounts.
But the tropical conditions of Panama made it incredibly unpredictable, didn't it?
Extremely unpredictable. The heat and the extreme humidity caused the dynamite to literally sweat nitroglycerin.
Wait, sweat?
Literally sweat. Beads of pure nitroglycerin would form on the outside of the sticks.
Which makes it highly unstable.
Incredibly unstable.
Hmm.
A stray spark from a steam shovel, a heavy footfall, or just the ambient heat of the midday sun could set off tons of explosives prematurely.
That's terrifying.
Premature dynamite explosions were a daily hazard, and they killed instantly. 1 minute a silver crew was setting charges in the rock face, the next minute they were simply gone.
So let's look at the numbers we have in the sources. During the American era, from 1904 to 1914, the official record states there were about 5,600 deaths.
Right.
And the vast majority of those were Black West Indian workers on the Silver Roll. But I'm looking at these historical analyses, and they keep calling that 5,600 figure a minimum.
Yes.
Why is that? Why is it just a minimum?
This raises an important question about the historical record. It's a minimum because the bureaucratic record-keeping was just as segregated as the housing and the water fountains.
Oh, of course.
If you combine the deaths from the French attempt in the 1880s with the American construction era, the total number of dead is commonly estimated at between 25,000 and 27,500 people.
27,000. That is the population of an entire small city just wiped off the map.
And the reason the American figure of 5,600 is considered a drastic undercount is due to pure bureaucratic indifference. The deaths of silver roll workers were systematically underrecorded.
Because they just didn't care.
Exactly. If a gold roll worker, a white American, died, it was treated as a tragedy. There was extensive paperwork, official notifications sent to their family back in the States, a formal medical accounting of the cause of death.
But the silver workers were treated as extendable, interchangeable machinery.
Precisely. If a Barbadian laborer was crushed under a mudslide in the Cucaracha Formation or died of pneumonia in a squalid, unscreened barrack, the administration simply didn't care enough to accurately track it.
Wow.
They might note that a worker was missing from shift, but they weren't launching investigations. They just hired another man from the islands to take his place.
Think about that. Think about the profound insult of that reality. Your life is valued exponentially less while you are actively risking it to build this masterpiece.
Right.
And then, when the mountain finally takes you, your death isn't even worth the ink required to record your name properly in a ledger. You are statistically erased from the very history you built.
And that erasure continued literally into the earth itself.
What do you mean?
The final indignity of the gold and silver system was the segregation of death. The caste system didn't stop at the hospital doors. It extended directly into the graveyards.
Oh, what?
The West Indian dead were buried in segregated cemeteries, or frequently in unmarked mass graves. The sources point to cemeteries like Mount Hope, which became incredibly crowded with the bodies of the silver men.
The triumph of the canal, that elegant water staircase we marvel at, was physically built on top of their bodies,
Yes.
and the official record was engineered to forget their names.
Which brings us back to that opening day in August 1914.
Right.
The silence of the world may have been due to World War I, but the silence within the Canal Zone had been purposefully designed by the system.
It was baked in.
The dignitaries drinking champagne on the deck of the Ancon were celebrating a machine, intentionally oblivious to this segregated graveyard they were sailing through.
But here's where the story pivots, because the official record tried to erase them, but the workers themselves refused to be erased.
They really did.
They refused to let that bureaucratic silence be the final word. We have their first-hand testimonies, and this completely changes how we understand the canal.
This is perhaps the most vital piece of the historical record we are looking at today.
I agree.
For decades, the history of the Panama Canal was told entirely from the perspective of the engineers, the politicians, the American administrators, the gold roll.
The books were written by the people who designed the locks, not the people who dug the dirt.
But the silver workers eventually made sure their story was documented.
I was absolutely fascinated by the Box 25 archive at the Library of Congress. Let's explain how this collection even came to exist, because it's a remarkable piece of historical preservation.
As the 50th anniversary of the canal's opening approached in 1963, a group called the Isthmian Historical Society realized that the accepted history was dangerously incomplete.
Right, because the workers' voices were missing.
The voices of the massive labor force were completely absent. So they did something unprecedented. They put out a public call inviting any surviving non-American workers, the men and women of the Silver Roll, to write down the true story of building the canal from their own perspective.
They were asking people who were by that point in their 70s and 80s to look back half a century and recount their trauma.
Yes.
And the response was incredible. Hundreds of Afro-Caribbean men and women sat down and wrote out their memories.
And these aren't polished public relations statements.
Yeah.
They aren't filtered through an American engineer's diary. These are raw, visceral, lived experiences.
These essays and letters are collected in what is known as Box 25 at the Library of Congress, and the UNESCO Memory of the World Register actually lists them as a critical human document.
They are the single best primary source we have on what it actually meant to be a Silver Roll worker.
We have to share some of these specific voices with you. I want to talk about Constantine Parkinson.
Parkinson's account is deeply moving, and it completely shatters that sanitized narrative of elegant engineering we discussed earlier.
Yeah, his story is intense.
He started working on the canal as a teenage flagman. He was just a boy, thrust into one of the most dangerous, chaotic industrial environments on the planet, standing on the tracks in the Culebra Cut, trying to direct train traffic amidst the blasting.
And his description of the dynamite explosions is something that just stays with you. It's horrifying.
We have a direct quote from his 1963 essay where he describes the aftermath of a premature blast in the cut.
Yeah, he wrote, quote, "The flesh of men flew in the air like birds that day," end quote.
The flesh of men flew in the air like birds. It is a devastatingly poetic image.
It really is.
When we read the engineering specs about how many tons of dynamite were used, it's just a sterile number. But Constantine Parkinson forces us to look at the reality.
This is a teenager watching his coworkers being literally blown apart by the machinery of progress.
And then there's Albert Banister. His testimony gives us a slightly different angle. It's less about the explosive violence and more about the psychological toll of this environment.
Right. Banister worked in the boiler rooms at Cristobal, shoveling coal in just unbearable heat.
Banister's recollections focus heavily on how casually death moved through the labor camps.
Yeah, the casualness is what's so striking.
He describes a culture where mortality was so commonplace, so unrelenting, that it became almost mundane.
He writes about how men would just vanish. You'd finish your 12-hour shift in the boiler room, go to sleep in your crowded, unscreened barrack, and when you came back for the next shift, the man who worked beside you was dead.
Just gone.
He had been crushed by coal or blown up in the cut or taken by yellow fever or pneumonia in the night. And the chilling part is that Banister notes they were only spoken of in passing.
There were no grand memorials.
No. The administration didn't stop work to mourn a silver roll worker. You just picked up your shovel and kept feeding the boiler.
When you dissect the emotional weight of these accounts from Box 25, what emerges isn't just a story of victimization. It is a story of profound psychological resilience. To face that level of daily terror, combined with the systemic daily degradation of the gold and silver caste system, and to still survive, to actually build the structure and then to live to tell the tale half a century later, it's awe-inspiring.
These voices, Constantine Parkinson, Albert Banister, and the hundreds of others in that archive, they are the true center of the canal's history.
They are. Not the politicians cutting ribbons, not the dignitaries on the Ancon's deck.
But here's the thing that really struck me as I read these accounts. These letters were written in 1963, 50 years after the fact. But the trauma and the anger feel so incredibly fresh.
And there is a very specific structural reason why those memories were so vivid and raw in 1963.
What's the reason?
It wasn't just ancient history to them. It wasn't something they had left behind in their youth. Because the system itself, the gold and silver roll, didn't end in 1914 when the canal opened.
That is the kicker. You naturally assume, okay, the canal is built. The massive construction phase is over, so the temporary labor camp rules go away. The extreme measures vanish. The gold and silver system was not dismantled once the construction was finished. It endured for decades.
The bureaucratic architecture of segregation was far too useful and far too entrenched in the Canal Zone's administration to just be swept away. The formal phase out of the system didn't even begin to happen until the 1960s.
The 1960s, we are talking about multiple generations growing up under this imported Jim Crow.
Exactly.
You have the original builders and then their children and then their grandchildren all living in Panama, all forced to navigate a system that explicitly told them they were worth less than the white Americans running the canal.
Over the decades, union pressure and shifting political winds eventually forced the zone authorities to remove the most blatant, embarrassing gold and silver signs from the water fountains and the post office windows.
But taking down a painted sign doesn't dismantle a caste system.
No, it doesn't.
The structural inequalities remained firmly in place. The pay disparities continued. The segregated housing continued. The separate and chronically unequal schools for the descendants of the West Indian workers continued.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how this systemic erasure, this deeply ingrained racial caste system, forms a direct, undeniable line to future historical explosions.
You cannot treat human beings this way, generation after generation, for 60 years, and not expect a reckoning.
And that reckoning is exactly what happened. The simmering, multi-generational resentment of the gold and silver system directly fueled the grievances that exploded during the Martyrs' Day protests in January 1964.
Martyrs' Day is often summarized in the history books as a dispute over a flag, right?
Yes, that's the common narrative.
The story goes that Panamanian students wanted to fly the Panamanian flag next to the U.S. flag at a high school inside the Canal Zone. The American students resisted, the zone police intervened, and riots broke out. And yes, the flag was the spark.
It was.
But when you read these sources, when you understand the 60 years of gold and silver segregation, you realize that anger wasn't just about a piece of cloth.
The flag was merely the catalyst. The explosion of anger was about decades of imported Jim Crow. It was about a whole generation of Panamanians and West Indian descendants who had grown up looking through a chain-link fence at an artificial, heavily subsidized American suburb with manicured lawns, mosquito screens, and pristine hospitals.
Planted right in the middle of their own country.
Exactly. A paradise they were systematically excluded from, even though their fathers and grandfathers had died to build it.
It was the accumulated trauma of dehumanization, the poverty wages, the separate schools, the daily humiliations of being treated as second-class non-citizens in their own backyard.
The Martyrs' Day protests were the boiling over of a society that had been structurally designed to oppress them.
When a government builds a society with 2 sets of water fountains, 2 sets of schools, and 2 different graveyards, it is meticulously building a time bomb.
That's a great way to put it.
What does it mean for a country like Panama to have a 10-mile-wide strip of another country running right through its middle, operating under an entirely different, racially stratified set of rules?
It creates an unsustainable pressure cooker of inequity. The violence of 1964 was the inevitable result of the policies written by John Stevens and Theodore Roosevelt in 1906.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at the quiet, almost ignored opening of the canal in August 1914, overshadowed by the outbreak of World War I.
Right.
We've talked about the incredible mechanics of the Gatun locks, this gravity-fed water staircase that lifts mountains of steel into the air without a single pump.
And we've talked about the Kubber Cut, the treacherous geology of volcanic rock squeezing clay into a trench. It is an undeniable, incredible mechanical achievement.
But our mission today was to anchor that mechanical achievement firmly to the 150,000 West Indian men and women of the Silver Roll.
Because the canal simply doesn't exist without them.
We have to remember Constantine Parkinson, a teenager standing in the Kubber Cut, watching his friends blown apart like birds in the sky.
We have to remember Albert Banister shoveling coal in the Cristobal boiler rooms while the man next to him drops dead and is forgotten by the next shift.
We have to remember the Barbadian digger, exhausted and covered in mud, being threatened with jail time just for trying to drink water from the wrong pipe.
The reason this specific history matters so much today is because it forces us to recognize a fundamental truth about human endeavor. Infrastructure is never just concrete, steel, and water.
No, it isn't.
A canal, a bridge, a highway system, they are physical manifestations of the society that builds them. They are a reflection of the values, the priorities, and ultimately the prejudices of the people in power.
You can't separate the engineering from the administrative logic of its construction. The Panama Canal is a masterpiece of hydraulics, and it is also a monument built on a rigid racial caste system.
Both things are entirely true, and they exist in the exact same physical space.
It challenges us to look at the marvels of our modern world and ask the uncomfortable questions. Who was sacrificed for this progress?
Whose names were deliberately left off the bronze plaques? Whose deaths were considered acceptable losses by the bureaucracy?
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've uncovered from these records. We've talked at length about the immense, painstaking effort the U.S. government put into managing this segregation.
The bureaucracy of the bigotry.
Yes, that exact phrasing. Think about the administrative energy required to maintain it.
It was a massive undertaking just to keep people separate.
If a government was willing to go to such meticulous bureaucratic lengths to enforce a racial caste system in a foreign jungle, down to the exact physical placement of drinking fountains, the separate labeling of post office windows, the different currencies, and the separate ledgers for mass graves, how might that same administrative obsession with categorizing human worth have quietly shaped the institutions and policies we still interact with today?
It's a chilling thought. The gold and silver signs may have finally been taken down in the 1960s, but the administrative mindset required to invent them, the impulse to engineer a workforce by dividing it, doesn't just vanish into thin air.
Exactly. Long after the physical signs are gone, where else in our modern systems are we still sailing right past the hidden human cost? Where are we still acting just like the dignitaries on the Ancon, drinking champagne and celebrating the triumph of the machine while completely ignoring the people who dug the hole?
It's the silent, enduring legacy of the Silver Roll.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.